It's easy to take for granted the level of quality modern games bring us. No. But this didn't always used to be the case. Games used to be a little quirky, having some interesting gameplay mechanics. Here are 4 gameplay mechanics I'm glad have been left in the past, and I'm sure you'll completely agree with me and not be annoyed at any of the mechanics on this list. Okay, right off the bat, I think this is already a controversial one, but I hate tank controls. If you don't know what tank controls are, they're basically where no matter what orientation your camera is in, pushing forward on the analog stick moves your character in the direction they're facing, and you spin on the spot by moving left or right. I bet you're thinking that sounds rather reasonable, but then you'd be wrong. For starters, people don't move like tanks. Your character looks like an idiot when they run forward a few paces, then they have to slowly spin on the spot like Michael Keaton's Batman so they can move in a slightly different direction. Now I can't hate on tank controls entirely, because back in the PS1 era they were incredibly useful, if not essential. Since hardware was more limited back in the 90s, some games like Resident Evil had 3D rendered characters, but 2D static images as backgrounds with fixed camera angles that change whenever you run off screen. With tank control, since holding forward moves your character in the direction they're facing, no matter what the camera angle is, it means that every time the camera angle suddenly changes and you're obviously still holding forward on the analog stick, your character will just keep on running forward. But if you didn't have tank controls and instead you moved based on the camera angle, which is basically how every modern game works nowadays, then every time the camera angle suddenly changed, your character would just immediately do a 180 or a 45 or an indie grab 720, depending on what the new camera angle is. And your character could just run back and forth between the same 2 camera angles, and that wouldn't get annoying at all. Oh wait, we're talking about why tank controls suck. Okay, well they suck now, because we don't really have many fixed camera angle games anymore. And whilst tank controls were better off for locked off cameras, they are just objectively worse than controls based on camera orientation in 3D environments. I mean, just look at Tomb Raider, which was a completely 3D game where the camera orientated around Lara Croft, and the controls were so awkward. I even remember at the time it came out being like, this is so clunky, what the hell? The worst part about tank controls is that they're a massive momentum killer, and this is painfully apparent in Tomb Raider. A game where you're supposed to run and jump over obstacles and do parkour whilst dodging wolves is brought to a screeching halt every 5 seconds. For an action-adventure game, the controls are a massive obstacle. Credit where credit is due though, you can press circle to make Lara Croft do a 180, which does help. I take it for granted nowadays how easy and smooth it is to keep running in any direction I want, whilst also controlling the camera how I like it. Other than locked off camera angled games, I can see tank controls only really working on one other occasion, and that's with horror games. There's a reason that the only times you really see tank controls used in modern games are in horror titles, in part because they're harder and slower to use and make games even scarier. That was actually a nice side effect of tank controls in the 90s, because they made you slow and clunky, which is great for causing absolute panic when Nemesis is chasing you down a hallway, but you gotta slowly spin on the spot to run away. It's a fine line between scary and frustrating though. But Resident Evil was one game that gets it absolutely right, largely in part to the locked off cameras. Although even then I remember being in a room full of zombies and cursing at my TV when Leon took 7 years to turn around and I just kept getting caught in a biting animation. I don't know if this one quite counts as a mechanic or not, but it's so bad I want to talk about it. And that is the camera controls on the N64. I'm pretty much just slating one console here, and it's arguably the best console ever made, but nobody's perfect. Even the greatest among us have their faults. And this fault, these stupid yellow buttons of hell, are some of the worst in gaming. In fact, why stop there? This whole controller is an abomination. Who thought it was a good idea to make a controller with 3 grips? Last time I checked, humans don't have 3 hands. The design alone made the D-pad practically useless, since most games don't even bother to incorporate it anyway. Apparently though, the controller just wasn't uncomfortable enough, so Nintendo decided to make an analog stick that rips your thumb to shreds if you play longer than 5 minutes. Anyway, what was I on about again? Oh right, yeah, the camera controls. So since the N64 only had one analog stick, which to its credit is one more than the first PlayStation controller, they didn't have a second analog stick to use for camera controls, but they did have the C buttons. So now that the gaming world was entering 3 dimensions, we needed a smooth way to move the camera around, and Nintendo couldn't have done a crappier job. The Nintendo 64 is a great example of how far we've come in video game design, because GoldenEye is considered a critically acclaimed masterpiece, and honestly I'm with them. I've played so much GoldenEye growing up, and I've loved every minute of it. but playing it now, ooh, it is rough. It has not aged well. Using the C buttons to aim is a very clunky gaming experience. It's so clunky, in fact, that the game basically aims for you. And I don't mean a bit of aim assist. I mean, if an enemy is visible on the screen, your gun will just aim at them. If this didn't happen, nobody would manage to shoot anybody. But that's the price you pay for having 4 individual buttons to aim rather than an analog stick. Maybe the controller was the reason the N64 didn't sell as well as many other consoles, because the games were incredible. I'm so glad that most games nowadays are done with a live system and just have straight up health and checkpoints. Call me lazy, but whenever I die in a game, I don't want to have to replay the entire game from the beginning. This is probably a thing that was transferred from arcade games, since once you've used up all your lives and you've got no more credits to slot in, it's game over. So it's time for the next person to play, and of course the game needs to start from the beginning. Having lives has had a very slow transition out of the gaming sphere. So slow in fact, it's still not entirely gone. It's far less popular today, but there are some games that still use them, mostly Nintendo games. The big problem with lives is that they're either completely meaningless or absolutely infuriating. In Sonic the Hedgehog, you start the game with 3 lives, and if you get hit when carrying no rings, you lose a life. Lose all 3 and it's game over, and you have to start all the way back at the beginning of the game. So you could spend 2 hours playing the game, get to the final level and then die, and then you gotta start all over again. I typically just stop playing the game by that point. Now I'm not saying you should just start over exactly where you died, because then dying becomes meaningless, but starting an entire game again? Nope. While Sonic is too punishing, Super Mario 64 pats your head and says, there champ, you'll get him next time. When you die in Super Mario 64, you restart at the beginning of the level. You also have lives, but thankfully if you lose them all, you won't lose upwards of 20 hours of game time. Instead, you get sent back to the main menu. So basically it's the same as dying, except you just gotta start the game again and run back to the level and carry on where you left off. So it's like, okay, I didn't really lose anything. But most players probably won't even have to do this, because you'll have 7 billion lives in the game anyway, so it's pretty unlikely you'll die enough times to lose them all, making the idea of lives completely pointless. Nintendo games are notorious for this, but this is where checkpoints are such an integral part of game design, and this is pretty much the direction games headed. Some games are too forgiving with checkpoints and just respawn you right before the exact moment you died, and some are a bit too punishing, making you respawn 20 minutes ago. Or God forbid they put the checkpoint right before an unskippable cutscene, so you have to watch it over and over again and you keep dying trying to figure out how to kill the boss. But then again, maybe having a bit of downtime after dying in a boss battle could be good for you. In Dark Souls, pretty much every boss battle is a nice jog away from a bonfire, and since whenever you die you respawn at your last lit bonfire, every single time you die, and you'll die a lot obviously, it's a Souls-like game, you have to put on your trainers and jog right back to the boss. For some this is so frustrating, but for others who have just thrown their control out the wall, this could be a chance to take a break, plan out how they're going to take on the boss, and go in level-headed rather than do what I do and just dive in and swing as much as possible like I have infinite health, because who cares if I die? I'll just respawn right here and do it all over again. I'll be honest, the jog pisses me off, but it absolutely does make me act far more tactical when I fight the boss again, because it both gives me time to think, and because screw that jog again, I ain't doing that, I'm going to use my head this time. Balancing where to place checkpoints is hard though. Sometimes it's just too easy and you respawn exactly where you died, and other times you get sent before a real long encounter. Sometimes part of the fun of a specific encounter is figuring out how to get through the whole thing without dying, and sometimes it's just nice to have checkpoints to break it up along the way so you can tackle each part bit by bit. Sometimes this even happens with bosses, where their health is divided into 3 segments and there's a checkpoint between each one. I don't know where I stand on this divide, and to be honest, my opinion on it varies by game, and probably even my mood, so that's helpful. All I know is that checkpoints are the way to go and lives should be left in the dust, even though they're not mutually exclusive. I think I just wanted to talk about checkpoints. There was a beautiful time in the early 2000s when online gaming had started to get popular. It was the Wild West. You picked lobbies from a list that were powered by GameSpy, where you had no idea what was coming. Some lobbies were full of hackers, some specifically meant to find glitches, and if you were persuasive enough, many lobbies changed their whole vibe if you got enough people behind you.
Take this game back to Blockbuster and quit running up your mama's account, you bitch-made ass motherfucker.
But the important thing was that anyone could join. There was none of this MMR mumbo-jumbo or punishment for leaving a match early. Now, assuming you did join a lobby that was all about just playing the game as intended, and you were a better than average player, the chances are you were going to have a good time, because you'd likely be at the top of the leaderboards for most of your games, headshotting 12-year-olds running into walls and getting that 25 kill streak. But if you were worse than average, well then you would have been running into walls and getting headshotted by someone before a tactical nuke ends the game before your first kill. Obviously now with the introduction of skill-based matchmaking, everyone can play with people at a similar level to them, which makes for a much better match, even for the great players among us. I half joke about the better than average player having a good time. Sometimes it's nice to just chill and slap everyone with ease, but without a real challenge, it can get pretty boring too. I would know. I find it far more entertaining with modern skill-based matchmaking for two reasons. One being the fact you're playing with people at the same level as you, hopefully, but also because it adds another fun layer to the game where you try to improve your rank. And that's it for the mechanics that have been lost to the sands of time for good reason. Looking back, this video may sound pretty negative, but I like to think of it as a testament to how far video games have come. And now, here's 75 classic mechanics that need to come back.